All right, welcome back.
Hello.
Once again, it is that time for St. Peter's Adult Ed series on early and medieval church history. We're now firmly going into the medieval portion of the series.
And this is episode 6.
6 episodes. So by this point, for those of you who have been following along, you should be experts on the early church, on St. Augustine, on the women eunuchs and priestly intrigues of the Byzantine Empire.
Do we have a pithy name for this week's talk?
I'm thinking the faith moves north.
Yay.
Because as we were hinting at last time...
I need you to come up with clever names to get me through quarantine.
I'll work on it.
North to...
Northern exposure.
It's modestly funny. Okay.
So, last time when we were talking, we talked a lot about the political intrigue of the Byzantine Empire. We talked about Justinian and Theodora.
We had our great love story.
Mm-hmm.
Aww. Is there a love story today?
No.
Is there a murder mystery?
Yes, actually. Yes. Let's see. Who was it? Boniface, right?
Well, don't ruin the surprise.
Okay, I won't ruin the surprise. Anyway, last time we were talking about Christianity in empire at the center.
We talked about the Byzantines.
Exactly. With the rise of Islam, Christianity in a lot of those areas where Christianity was thought to be most thriving during this early church period begins to be less important.
Right.
However, as Christianity sort of dwindles in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, across North Africa and Egypt, and down into Nubia, Christianity is going to start moving further north. That trajectory had already been taking place, largely due to the rise of the Roman Empire, right?
Yeah, and the expansion through what we think of as Great Britain.
Exactly. And the rise of monasticism. You had these monastic communities using some of those imperial roads to move north.
And every region sort of has its own monastic flair, if you will. Celtic monasticism looks different from, like, the Stylites, for example.
Oh yeah, absolutely. What we find is Western monasticism is going to look completely different than Eastern monasticism. Maybe it's helpful just to talk a little bit about some of the divisions among monastics. So the first...
Who is your favorite? What's your favorite monastic movement?
That's a great question. I think the Franciscans.
Okay. Why?
I like the mendicants. I like the idea that they were out among the people. I like the idea that they were preachers. There's always something that seems very gentle about the Franciscans. They are actually a much later development, though. They're not even going to come up in this series.
I was about to say during this time period, though, which...
Oh, during this time period?
Right.
Probably the Benedictines.
I was about to say.
The Benedictines
hospitality,
are where it's at.
Good food. What's not to like?
Medical care. I mean, these Benedictine communities, when the empire fell, these monasteries were sort of the social glue, right? All of your social services, all of your education, all of that kind of important stuff went on at monasteries.
And I have a soft spot for sort of the Irish Celtic monastic movement, Kevin, and all that good stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In the East...
As long as you don't have to be a stylite. I'm not going to be a stylite.
So a stylite is somebody who sits on top of a pole for many, many, many years. Like Simeon the Stylite.
Yeah.
Was up there for something like 25 years.
I mean, because why not?
I mean, we talk about quarantine, right? We're in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
We could take a lot of hints for how to stay in one place
Simeon
from the
the
Stylites. Yeah. They figured out how to do it.
That is not the life of an extrovert.
I had all of their deliveries probably from Cugini's.
I feel like I would be better, in the kitchen or the garden of some.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
No great silence.
Well, the thing is, it's interesting, though, there was a lot of silence in a Benedictine monastery, but the communities always came together for prayer and that kind of thing. But yeah, so monasticism, the rise of monasticism we addressed a little bit when we were talking about I guess it was in lecture 2 or second conversation.
Who can remember?
We were talking about the desert fathers and mothers,
Oh,
St.
sure.
Anthony going into the desert, removing themselves from the kind of cosmopolitan Christianity that was developing in Alexandria, looking for that sort of edginess. And you do have the stylites who are attempting to be edgy, living in these extreme
But
conditions.
this is a big
on the
movement
edge.
from this. This is more communal.
Right. So the other groups were called Cenobites. You have hermits, people who go and live alone, and then Cenobites, people who live together, monks and nuns, living in community. And through figuring out how to live in community, which is challenging,
Yeah.
right? Living with the same people under the same roof, sharing
Isn't
the
it?
same.
Isn't it?
I don't know what you mean.
But these are like what we think of when we think of like
Monks
classic
and nuns.
depictions of monks
Exactly.
and nuns and
Exactly.
and sort of the dark ages. Like when we think about
Stone, lots of stone.
stone and abbots and
dormitories.
abbesses and monks and like
Robes.
no, not robes. Calligraphy, but what illustrated.
Illuminated manuscripts.
Thank you. Illuminated manuscripts. Marginalia.
Absolutely, absolutely. So these Cenobites, these monastic orders began developing throughout the East, but really took off in the West.
So what year are we talking? We're talking about that transition to the Middle Ages. So is this like 500?
About that, yeah. 500 is a good...
500 to 800-ish?
You know, really early 400s, where you have a lot of the fall of Rome happening, barbarian invasions. As the Roman Empire declines and falls, you really enter what historians view as the Middle Ages.
Right.
This time between the antique period, where Rome and the Greco-Roman culture was sort of this dominant force
Sure.
in Europe, to the modern period. In between that, they talk about the Middle Ages, because they're in the middle of antiquity and modernity. In some ways, people talk
And
really
also before the
disparagingly.
Renaissance.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. The rebirth. All of these terms are kind of disparaging in some sense, aren't
I
they?
know, people don't like it. It's not nice to talk about the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Or
Well, right. Those early years of the Middle Ages, especially, were called the Dark Ages.
But do they sound fun, or do they sound a lot like plague?
See, I think there are so many misconceptions about the Middle Ages. For one, medievals bathed. Medievals loved taking baths.
Right. I'm not saying they were dirty. I'm just saying I think I would prefer to wait and live in the Renaissance.
There were still plagues in the Renaissance,
Wait, there's still plagues now.
apparently. Anyway, John Cassian introduces monasticism to the West in the early 400s.
Yep.
And Saint Benedict, who lived from 480 to 547, established this rule for monastic life that included praying the hours,
And hospitality.
hospitality, prayer, work, and really stability. Stability was one of the major aspects of life in a Benedictine monastery. So they did not go wandering about. You were expected to live under the rule of an abbot. You would pray throughout the course of the day. You would do your work. People would come to you for services, religious and secular.
Whether you're brewing beer or you have milk cows or whatever, making cheese, whatever you're...
Exactly. Monasteries were sort of these economic units that provided people with options. You could work for an abbot in the same way that you would work for a manerial lord. So it's these really important economic, religious, political communities. And as Rome is falling apart, these monasteries become increasingly important. Interestingly, the monasteries don't just spread sort of from south to north, though. They actually kind of start in the north,
Yep.
right? In places like Ireland.
Celtic monasteries.
St. Patrick.
I took an awesome
everyone
trip to
knows
visit
the
Celtic
stories.
monasteries once. I could bore you with it for hours, but I won't.
Everyone loves St. Patrick, because what do we know about St. Patrick?
Pirates.
Shamrocks, pirates,
Snakes.
green beer, on St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah.
The big parade.
The Trinity, 4-leaf clover. Bad metaphor.
Three-leaf.
4-leaf clover, 3-leaf clover.
Three-leaf
Three parts of
shamrock.
the Trinity, 4-leaf clover is lucky.
A 4-leaf clover is very lucky.
But he was kidnapped as a teenager by
Right.
pirates and sold into slavery. That's an awesome beginning for an adventure. It's swashbuckling.
Absolutely. And he lives through this period of slavery, manages to get out,
And goes back.
and decides to go back.
Yeah.
Which is one of those incredible sort of testaments, I think, to the power of the Christian gospel as this kind of conciliatory narrative. That
Or
you
once
would be,
you've been a pirate, you're always a pirate.
Could be.
No, Steve's right.
But he goes back to Ireland and begins establishing these monastic communities. And these monastic communities are going to be the absolute backbone of religious life.
And they are so gorgeous, guys. Even the ruins that are all over Ireland are gorgeous. Gorgeous, gorgeous.
You mean just the way they're
The
situated?
landscape
and
and all of the carved stone and the architecture and the graveyards, and I mean they're just
well, and
it's gloriously beautiful the way they sort of incorporated their structure into the natural world. It's so green and it's so lovely.
well, and in a lot of ways, I wonder how much of that is related to the fact that the Irish were pagans and had this sense of the natural world as endued with all of these spiritual forces. So by placing their monasteries in these very dramatic natural locations, it would sort of connect to that innate sense of Celtic spirituality.
All we think about,
Not
the
innate, but
Celtic
traditional.
knots and all of the stone
Right,
carving
Celtic
work
crosses.
and everything. It's a very thin place. Very thin.
Right. Well, and the Irish monks, what's so fascinating about Irish monks is they were copying and preserving manuscripts and texts and all these documents that in Rome were being destroyed. So there's often this argument about the Irish saving civilization.
And you can see them. They're on display in museums all over Dublin. They're just, I don't know. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Irish monks are preserving, first of all, spreading Christianity in Ireland, ensuring that, or not ensuring, but sort of promoting Christianity in Ireland and ensuring that future generations will have this very solid Irish Catholic identity that to a large extent remains today. And it's rooted in this monastic tradition. In addition to being this place of preservation for all of these texts founded by St. Patrick, they were also a launch point for further missionary activity. So from Ireland, you have missionaries going to Scotland. St. Columba, for example, goes and forms the Iona community, I believe, which is still there, and John Bell is there.
Haven't been to Iona yet.
You can visit Iona.
Can we go to Iona?
That would be a
We're all out of
wonderful
quarantine.
parish trip. You go from Iona and you start to go down into Europe as well. And that's where you get people like Boniface and these missionaries who famously hold up their Bibles to defend themselves from barbarian swords and things like that. It's
Not the
very
weapon I would choose,
swashbuckling.
but okay.
You can actually go see, I think it was St. Boniface, the Bible that he used to defend himself. It has a big gouge in it from where the sword, a broadsword, came down. He ultimately died. He was ultimately murdered.
Shocker.
So there's the murder mystery for you
Okay.
this week. But yeah, a lot of these missionaries went and engaged with local chieftains, local kings, and promoted Christianity that way. All spreading out from Ireland, all deeply rooted in this Celtic monastic tradition.
Yeah, I was just looking up what year the Book of Kells was. It's beautiful too.
Is that 9th century?
Yes, it's a little bit later. Also known as the Book of Columba. It's one of the early sort of,
One of the great legacies, really, of Irish monasticism.
totally. The Columban monks, who were originally from Iona,
So-
relocated to Kells by the early 9th century.
These monasteries were situated in very, lovely places. A lot of the buildings themselves, though, were very, very simple, very humble.
They're monks.
Right, really resembling these kind of piles of stone. Later, as the centuries go on, you have the development in France.
They're like towns.
Right, monasteries become these incredibly richly endowed places, magnificent architecture,
Money.
absolutely the height of sophistication in medieval Europe.
Just in time to pillage them and take their money.
Right, exactly. Lots of people, lots of marauding hordes come to try to steal their money.
Pirates, marauding hordes, plagues. We got it all.
Nevertheless, these monasteries are really forming the backbone of early medieval Christianity. So between the year 500 and 1000.
Well, and they also, I mean, it's so interesting. They also, because of their connection to hospitality, they're also on travel routes. So like travelers travel between monasteries too. I mean, it's interesting from a transportation perspective as well. Especially when you have the Roman Empire decline and things get a little bit more loosey-goosey.
And dangerous, right?
Yep.
You had this idea of Pax Romana, the peace of Rome.
But when you don't have that, monasteries are still safe harbors for
Right.
travelers going between locations.
Exactly. So you have this network of monastic communities forming the backbone of Christianity across Europe. They're the ones doing the catechization and all of that kind of work. You also have this rise of Rome as a central place of importance.
Rome, the city, not Rome, the empire.
Exactly.
I just feel the need to specify that.
This begins to form. There's always been a sense that as the successor of Peter,
Yep.
right, the Roman
rock.
pontiff, the Pope in Rome, has a special position.
Sure.
That being said,
The Bishop of Rome.
the early church, there were multiple centers that were viewed as having almost kind of equal prestige and regard. People talked about first among equals and ecumenical patriarchs, and
We still do that sometimes.
exactly. But there were multiple points, multiple cities, multiple popes, you could say, in the early.
When did they start
church.
really referring to themselves as popes?
Well, pope comes from the word papa,
Right, no, I know. But
which
when
just
was,
sort of means holy father.
when
That
was
fairly
there like
early
the
on.
first, I guess Peter, I know, but
Yeah, I'm not exact, but that happened fairly early. So by this point, you had the Pope in Rome, but you also had the Pope in Alexandria. You had the Pope in Constantinople. You had the Pope in Antioch, the Pope in Jerusalem.
so they're sort of like the patriarchs.
Exactly. They're these leading bishops in these territories. What begins to happen is the Pope in Rome is going to gain increasing influence over all of the Christian lands to sort of the north and west. So Western Europe.
And I feel like we need to say something about the role of Pope. And I know many of you know this. This isn't like our dear Pope Francis. These popes were warriors.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They had armies. They
And especially as we get into the High Middle Ages, I
were
think,
warlords.
yeah, and I think we'll do a whole sort of discussion on Christianity and politics in
Right.
the Middle Ages, maybe even next time.
But like, I mean, it's just so far from our image of,
Right.
at least in our time, the Pope is some very elderly man who's very kind, surrounded by children, does a lot of blessing. These guys were on horseback, marauding, basically.
Right, they were
Yeah.
definitely playing the political game.
Well, but also like a physical, leading troops into battle often, which, I mean, I think that's always a surprising thing to
You
me
had
when I remember
independent papal states.
it. Yes. The Papal States.
And armies and all of that kind of stuff. Really beginning with Pope Gregory, so he's 540 to 604, so right up to the year 600, you have this centralization of influence of the papacy over the West. The papacy in Rome wants to begin to claim a lot more primacy over the other patriarchs as the successor of Peter. You have the so-called Gregorian reforms under Pope Gregory I, which again are centralizing authority in Rome. And he is also encouraging more missionary efforts to the north. So the story goes that he saw a group of slaves in a slave market in Rome. And he noticed them and he thought they were very beautiful. And he said, "Where are those young slaves from?" And they said, "Oh, these are the Angles, right? They're from England, Angles." And he says, "Surely you mean angels and not angles. I have to send a missionary to save this beautiful people." So the story goes, I think the English people
Wrote
tell
the
the story.
Yeah. Do you?
They like that pretty well. But he then sends Augustine of Canterbury
Yes.
north. And that's where we get Canterbury Cathedral. And the sort of primacy of Canterbury.
I could also show you lots of pictures from my trip to Canterbury. I could bore you,
And
but I
she
won't.
can recite the Canterbury Tales as well.
Which are from later.
They're much
Chaucer
later.
is later.
They're much later. I feel like it bears some mention, though, that Augustine of Canterbury is remembered as a very tolerant for that time kind of thinker.
Oh, the characters are so good. At some point, we need to just do a lecture on that. Bertha and Augustine. Oh, it's so good.
Right, because he's working
back.
with a lot of the political leaders at the time, working with a lot of these early English chieftains, attempting to convert these different English groups to Christianity. But ultimately, people have noted that in his recommendations for how to deal with pre-Christian British culture, he's very tolerant for activities that people would engage in that might incur a rather harsh penance. In, say, for example, France, he suggests a much lighter penance. So he was a fairly tolerant leader. Kind of a fascinating guy.
Are we talking about Augustine?
Yeah. Nevertheless, both Augustine and Gregory sort of highlight this kind of northward influence and movement of the church.
Did you talk about Alfred and Bertha?
No, we didn't get into all of the
I love
the
them.
finer points. But if you want to read about that, you can read the Venerable Bede. Right? The
Bede.
Venerable Bede writes the ecclesiastical history of the English people.
If we ever get a cat, I'm going to name it the Venerable Bede.
That'd be awesome to have a church cat
Venerable Bede.
that's named the Venerable Bede.
Mm-hmm.
The movement to the north, though, is really solidified. The sort of main influence being in the north is solidified in the Carolingian dynasty.
Right. Charles
So,
Martel.
It's hard to imagine this, but Northern Europe at the time would have been considered an absolute backwater.
Well, yeah.
Nothing important happens in the north. Everything important happens around the Mediterranean.
And that is going to persist as a thought for hundreds of years.
Right.
Even into Chaucer's time. Like, especially the Germanic tribes, those people are crazy, it's wild, it's rough, it's the equivalent to the Wild West mentality. Like,
Right. Yeah. Nevertheless, with the rise of Charlemagne, you have this new source of intellectual and political and military influence in the north, in Northern Europe, in Western Europe. It bears mentioning a little bit. Charles Martel is the founder of this dynasty. He fights famously at the Battle of Tours. You remember the expansion of Islam is coming north, all the way through North Africa, then across the Strait of Gibraltar, up through Spain, into France. He fights the Battle of Tours, or is it Tours? How do you say that? A French speaker could tell us.
We don't have one.
I've always said the Battle of Tours and heard it that way too.
I've always heard Charles Martel was kind of a handful.
Right, they called him the Hammer.
Yeah.
A very talented warrior. He stops the advance of the Caliph, and I think the Pyrenees kind of become the high watermark of the expansion of Muslim empire. Charles Martel, for his victory, is awarded this kind of recognition by the Pope as the head leader of Europe,
It's
the
like
head
this
political
great
leader of Europe.
protector thing.
Pope Stephen II makes his descendants, the Carolingians, the protector of the papacy, and Pope Leo III crowns Charlemagne the Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day in the year 800.
And that's what I always remember from whatever medieval class I took in high
Christmas
school.
Day in the year
Christmas
800.
Day 800.
Well, and it's important and it's symbolic because the first Rome, of course, is Rome, the
Sure.
Rome of the Caesars and all of them. Second Rome is Constantinople. Here you now have a leader, the Pope, saying that Charlemagne is the defender of the papacy. The Carolingians are the defender of the papacy. It used to be the emperor in Constantinople. So here you have the Pope saying, I don't really care about Constantinople anymore. What I care about is what's happening north. The Romans are the ones up above us.
I always think of that great Saturday Night Live skit, Baba Wawa. Okay, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman. Discuss. But
That's right.
Clumps, I'll give you a
Neither
topic.
holy nor Roman nor an empire. The thrice oxymoron of Holy Roman Empire. But the reason they chose to call it the Holy Roman Empire was rooted in this idea that the Romans were the defenders of the Catholic faith. And hence the Holy Roman Empire was whoever was defending the papacy, whoever was defending
Mother
Rome.
Church.
Exactly. It's important to talk, I think, a little bit about Charlemagne. He rules from Aachen, and he is one of the and Aachen is in, I think, modern day Belgium, so up north. And he's a great example of why the Middle Ages were not as backward as people thought they were.
There was dancing and lute playing.
Exactly.
There's music and
He's a
art.
patron of the arts and learning. They talk about the Carolingian Renaissance.
they?
Music, architecture, very impressive architecture, literature and writing. In fact, the script Times New Roman was developed in courts in
What?
Aachen. Yeah, it's not actually from Rome. It's from this time period.
New
Romans
Roman.
didn't write that way. You have
They're
this...
making fonts. They made wingdings.
Exactly. You have this...
Who made Comic Sans?
I don't know who made Comic Sans. I think that was a middle school principal, because that's the only place I ever frequently used or saw Comic Sans when I was in middle school. But that would have been
was also
right at the turn of the century. So maybe it was because I remember learning in high school like never use Comic Sans,
This is
because
not
I
an
think
academic font.
we all went hard toward Comic Sans in middle school, and then they said, please turn in Times New Roman. Anyway, we digress.
So, Charlemagne. Military is always what I think of.
Yes.
That he just conquered everybody and everyone's like, oh, Charlemagne, okay, I guess I'd be a Christian
he
now.
conquers all of Europe. Basically what is today Germany, France, and everything in between Germany and France, and plus a little more.
But he can't hold it together.
Right, because of the laws of inheritance, it's divided between his sons, right? Louis the Pious and Louis the Bald, and you have all these various...
With the pear-shaped head.
Right. Anyway...
Frederick the Dimpled. I made that up.
Ultimately, what's interesting, though, what's important to point out, is that this is one of the first times in history or certainly the history of the Middle Ages, where you have people being forcibly converted. He gave the Saxons, when he conquered the Saxons, he gave them the option of either converting to Christianity or dying. They had to convert to Christianity on pain of death.
Jesus is looking good.
Right. It was not that way with the Celtic missionaries.
Right, exactly.
It was not that way with the Benedictine missionaries. Here you have this kind of top-down enforcement of Christianity. Yeah, we are not, we're just sort of going to talk a little bit about this idea that from the conquests of Charlemagne, you have this entity called the Holy Roman Empire develop.
It's a hot mess.
It is. It's this,
And it doesn't get resolved.
A puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, Swiss cheese, this kind of massive grouping of different dukedoms and principalities and monasteries.
This is how
and
you end up with
bishoprics and-
22 German principalities.
Exactly. And that's just principalities. You're not including all the other little pieces of the Holy Roman Empire. But this is really the realm of knights and castles and halls
Damsels and
damsels
dragons.
And all of that stuff is developing
Courtly love.
here. You have, of course, feudalism developing.
Vassals, vassalage, fiefdoms.
Medievals have a very hierarchical world, and that's going to be mirrored in a lot of the theology and theological understandings of how people fit into this huge scheme of the cosmos. Nevertheless, you also have this developing role of the church as a political entity and political player.
And a military power.
And the church and the state are going to start going head to head over who is in charge, who gets to decide.
And that's going to last forever.
Absolutely. It will last forever, but in some ways, during the Middle Ages, the church actually had the power to back up its claims to political primacy.
It does for a long time.
Let's see. What are some other things to address?
I want to see pictures.
Move northward. We have some pictures here.
Mendicant orders.
You have a revival in religion coming. Ultimately, I think that kind of will move us into the next class, right? Or the next conversation.
Are we waiting to do all this?
I think so, because I'm thinking that we should do...
It's a big change.
Right, I'm thinking that we should do one discussion on, like, the Crusades and politics, and then another discussion on the art, architecture, learning of the Middle Ages. I think this discussion was important to see that Christianity has moved north. Christianity has become the enforced religion of much of Western Europe. Various groups will hold out with some remnants of paganism, but nevertheless, you're going to have this massive enforcement of Christianity, this kind of top-down enforcement of Christianity beginning. Monks will enter lots of areas and attempt to sort of introduce the more kind of slow leaven of the Christian gospel. Fascinatingly, though, you have a lot of pagan holdovers.
Well, I was about to say, you have a lot of pagan holdovers, and also, especially in areas of forced conversion, you have a lot of folklore religion coming into Christianity, too.
Exactly.
A lot of our celebrations, Christmas celebrations, all of that.
Right. Very important in Germanic religion were trees, the forest.
Light conquering dark. So all of those images are still held on to.
Right. In fact, when Boniface wanted to go and convert a group of Germans, a Germanic tribe, he went and he cut down this massive oak.
Yeah, cutting down the sacred grove is not a great idea.
And he built a church, out of the timbers of it. And in some ways, there is this kind of supersessionist sense that here the old has replaced, or the new has replaced the old. But you can also look at it, exactly, the old has been transformed. The oak may not be there as the oak, but the boards are now the church, and it's the same sacred spot. And so there's lots of this kind of back and forth folk religion that embodies a lot of the kind of European paganism.
Well, and it's a very masculine religion. It's a very warrior religion. It's a very It's brutal.
In fact, there was one missionary.
Not a lot of grace.
Right. Actually, one missionary who went to preach among the barbarians. He was actually an Aryan missionary named Wufalus or Ufala. And he refused to translate the Book of Kings into their language because he said, you're already so violent. You don't need any war stories. You have enough violence. Yeah. So I guess they never found out what happened with Solomon in the temple.
Yeah, tough.
Yeah. I guess the way to sum it up then is that Christianity moves north and Christianity kind of conquers Europe in a sense through the efforts of Charlemagne. Christianity is introduced at the more humane level through monks. Christianity becomes a European religion, and as Islam continues to take more and more of a foothold in Asia Minor and North Africa, increasingly Christianity is going to
get bent out of shape.
Well, yeah, in
about
those
the invasion
areas.
of the Holy Lands by
right, exactly,
Islam.
Exactly. And they're going to talk about reconquering those areas.
And they're going to try a whole bunch.
Exactly. You're going to have lots of crusades. Interestingly, in some of the
including
crusades...
the children's crusade.
That's, just an abysmal failure. You're also going to have some crusades, though, where they attack other Christians.
Sure, why not?
Because you're going to have this growing divide between Roman Catholic Christians and then Orthodox Christians, right? The East and the West. That's another thing to look forward to.
Just more division and bloodshed and plagues. I love Christian history.
Absolutely.
So who's your favorite person from the period?
That's a good question. I very much, Charlemagne, I dislike the sort of forcible conversion aspect.
Charlemagne's your favorite?
But he worked with Alcuin.
Sure.
Who was sort of one of the leading scholars in Aachen at the time. I think Alcuin.
All right.
Would be. Some of the leading scholars in Aachen at the time were, again, very humane men of letters, you might say. And there was a kind of gentleness to them and a refinement to them that I think is sort of interesting. I find it very congenial.
Fair enough.
What about you?
Oh, I'm going to go with Canterbury. I'm going to go
with
Augustine and the Venerable Bede and all of sort of the high-ranking lady officials and the chieftains and chieftain ladies who are like, build me a chapel and I'll decide if I like Jesus.
That's right.
I kind of like that.
You have to have some feats of strength.
I need feats of strength. I need some jewelry, and then I'll contemplate maybe having Jesus. No, I mean, I love the sort of, the stories are all very endearing of people having these heartfelt, powerful religious conversion experiences, and I don't know.
Absolutely.
What can I say? I'm a softie for Anglo-Catholic history.
Yeah. Well, and one of the points I was trying to make about Augustine of Canterbury is that there is this kind of tolerance, this kind of level-headed tolerance in the English church history from the beginning.
Well, it
it
was out of necessity. He didn't want to be killed. Right. You had to appeal to your...
And not just didn't want to be killed, but he didn't want to force too much. He didn't want to alienate his listeners too much, but he also didn't want to, completely break off from tradition, which is in some ways what every missionary has to work through, right? Is how do you speak to a new audience using their idiom, using their culture, while at the same time remaining true to your kind of Christian identity, to the Christian narrative. Okay, so next time, the church gets political, right? Things are getting political next time.
More political.
Right. We often say that, the church is no place for politics is one of those kind of things that you'll hear. For the medievals, that idea would have made absolutely no sense.
No.
They would have said, what do you mean? The church is the place for politics.
Yep.
So we will talk about that next time.
All right. Thank you, friends.
Absolutely.
We'll see you
Thank
next
you for
week.
joining us.
Bye.